Hey, thank you so much for clicking on this video. Before we get started, I wanted to show you the finished product of this video. So here's some gameplay. Now everything you see related to the art that was put into this game, we won't be covering in this video, but we will be showing you how to create all the controls and the basic gameplay. Now you can download our version of this game on both Android and iOS. You can also go to our website and play it in WebGL form. All of those links will be down in the description below this video. Now if you finish this tutorial and you have a working product that you wish to publish, then the only thing that we ask is that you change your game enough so that you won't get nailed with copyright. The other thing that we ask is that throughout your game you have a URL link that will take people to this video so that they too can learn how to make this game. In the description we've also included a link that will take you to where you can download a Unity package. In this Unity package we have one UI button that when clicked will take people to a URL, and you can set that URL in the script attached. Hey everyone, welcome back to InfoGamer. Today I wanted to try something new. Recently I've been playing this mobile game called Color Bump 3D, which is currently sitting at number 2 on the top free charts for Android. Here's some gameplay for Color Bump 3D, and I've actually really enjoyed playing this game. I can see why it's number 2 at the moment. Now while I was playing this game, I was surprised by how basic and simple this game really is, and it made me want to see if I could recreate this game in one video. Now it's not going to be an exact copy of the game, but we'll see how close we can get. Now if you want to play Color Bump 3D for yourself, we'll leave links to where you can download it in the description below. Color Bump was also developed by Good Job Games. Now before we begin, make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you can get updates when we publish new videos. Okay, so to get started, we want to create a new project, and so here I have the Unity Hub opened, and I'm going to click the New button. We can then give our project a name, a location, and then we can determine whether we want it to be 2D or 3D. Now the original Color Bump game is 3D, and so we're going to leave our game set to 3D, and I'm going to click Create Project. Alright, so I've created my new project and I've set up my workstation. The next thing that I want to do is start creating the basic organization for my file system. Now there might be some more folders that we can add as we go along, but the next thing that I want to do is start setting up the basic game scene. And to do this, we want to first start by creating the platform that the ball will roll on. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to rename it to platform. We can then go to the create drop-down menu and select 3D object and then click on cube. We then want to make this cube a child to the platform. For the platform object, we want to make sure that we center it in our scene. And then for the cube object, we want to move it over in the Z direction by 0.5. This will make it so that we can scale the platform object and have the child cube object grow in one direction. And so I'm going to set the scale of our platform to 20 in the X, 0.5 in the Y, and 100 in the Z. And there you can see how it grows just in one direction. The next thing that we want to do is create the ball that our players will be controlling. So I'm going to select the create drop-down menu, and then I'm going to go to 3D object, and I'm going to select sphere. I can then rename this object to something like player ball. Okay, so I positioned the ball at 0 in the X direction, 0.755 in the Y direction, and 5 in the Z direction. We'll probably end up changing the Z direction, but the next thing that we want to do is reposition the camera so that it's looking down at the ball. Alright, so the transform I have for the camera is 0 in the X direction, 15 in the Y direction, 0 in the Z direction, and then I've rotated the camera down by 40 degrees. Now one thing that I noticed about Color Bump 3D is that the ball is usually white, and then the objects that you can touch are also usually white, but the platform is a different color. That way the ball doesn't blend in to the ground. And so we're going to create a new material. I'm going to call it platform material. We can then give it a color. I'll just pick red. And then we want to apply it to our platform cube. Now Now you'll notice that the ball isn't quite in the camera view, and so let's move it forward just a little bit. We'll say 8. Now the next thing that we need to do is add a rigid body component to our ball. So I've added that component, and then what we want to do is freeze the position in the Y direction. Now the reason why we want to freeze the position in the Y direction is because in ColorBump 3D, I noticed that the ball never bounces off of objects vertically. The ball also never falls off any ledges, and so we might as well keep the ball on the same Y plane. Now this is something that we could change for our game. We could allow the ball to fall off the edges and go off of jumps and ramps and stuff like that. But for now, we'll just leave it as freezing that position. So now that we've set up our basic scene, let's start programming some player controls. So I'm going to go to our scripts folder. I'm going to right click, select create C# script, and let's name this player controller. I'm then going to open it up, and the first control that we want to create is the ability to have the ball follow your finger horizontally. So we're going to need some variables, and up at the top, let's go ahead and create those variables. The first one is going to be a public camera, and we'll call this my camera. And the next one can be a public float, and we'll call this lerp speed. Once we have these variables, let's scroll down to the bottom and create a new function for this control. This is going to be a void function, and we'll call it horizontal movement. Now in order to get the ball to follow wherever your finger is, we need to do what's called a raycast. And so to create a raycast, we need to first start with a local variable of type ray, and we'll call it ray. And then we're going to set it equal to myCamera.screen.pointToRay. We then need to pass in our mouse position as the parameter. And so I'm going to type input.mousePosition. Once we've created our ray, we then need to create a local variable of type raycastHit, and I'm going to call it hit. This will be for the return objects of whatever our ray touches. We then need to cast our ray, and so this is going to go inside the conditions of an if statement. We're going to check to see if physics.raycast. We're then going to pass in our ray as the parameter. We're then going to out the hit, and then we'll type a value for the distance that we want our ray to travel, and we'll just say 100. Inside this if statement, we're going to lerp the ball's x position to the x position of the point that our ray touches. And so this is going to be transform.position equals vector3.lerp For the first parameter, we're just going to pass in transform.position. For the second parameter, we're going to create a new vector3. And for the x value, we're going to pass in hit.point.x. And for the y, we're going to pass in transform.position.y. And for the z, we're going to pass in transform.position.z. For the third parameter, we're going to pass in our lerp speed times time.delta time. The next thing that we need to do is call this function, and we're going to call it within our update function, but we first want to check to see if we're clicking the left mouse button or if we're touching the screen. And so I'm going to check to see if input.getButton, and then we're going to pass in fire1. We can then call our horizontal movement function, and there I'm going to save it. We can go back to Unity and test it out. So first off, I want to select our ball game object. I'm then going to drag on the player controller script. We then need to assign the myCamera variable, which is the main camera from our hierarchy, and we're going to set a lerp speed. I'm going to set it to 3. Now I'm going to click play and see if it works. There we go. You can see that it's following my mouse wherever it goes. And that is a little slow. I could probably make it go faster. We'll see if we can, I don't know if it's down that makes it faster. Nope, it's up. Let's try 5. That's pretty good for now. Now let's try and get the forward movement of our ball. And so I'm going to go back to my script. And then we need to add some more variables up the top. The first variable is going to be a public float, and this will be our ball speed. Now the next variable that we might need is a public float, and this is going to be our camera speed. The next one is going to be a public float, and this is going to be our ball force. There's also one more variable that we'll need, and I'll add this up at the top of my script, and this will be our rigid body. Let's now initialize our rigid body in the start function. So my RB equals get component rigid body parentheses semicolon. Now let's scroll down and create a new function. This will be for our forward movement. So I'm going to type void and then forward movement. And now let's just try applying the ball speed to the forward velocity of our rigid body. And so I'm going to type my RB.velocity equals vector3.forward, and I'm going to multiply that by our ball speed. We then need to call this function, and since this function deals with physics, let's call it in the fixed update function. So I'm going to type void and then fixed update. We can then just call our forward movement function without any conditions. Let's go ahead and hit save, and then we'll go back to Unity. Once it's reloaded, let's click play, and then we can gauge what value we need to set our ball speed to. Alright, so nothing's moving, and that's because our ball speed is set to 0. So let's set it to something like 5, and there you can see that it's now moving. And as I click the left mouse button, I can also move the ball left and right. So it looks like we got the forward movement working. The next thing that we need to do is have the camera move. And so let's go back to our script, and we'll scroll down to the bottom, and we'll create a new function. This one will be a void function, and we'll call this camera movement. Now for our camera movement, we don't want to have the camera anchored to the position of the ball, because then the ball would always look like it's in the center of the screen. Instead, we want to move the camera at a constant speed, kind of like we are with the ball. And so I think the best option would be to add a rigid body to our camera. That way we can move it at a constant velocity as we are with the ball. So let's scroll up to the top and create a new variable for the rigid body of our camera. This is going to be a public rigid body, and then we're going to call this camera RB. Now let's scroll down back to our function, and in here we can call our camera RB, then dot velocity, and set it equal to vector3.forward, and then we want to multiply it by our camera speed. Then we can call this function inside our fixed update. Now I'm going to save this script, and we can go back to Unity. Now one thing I noticed about Color Bump 3D is that the camera is always moving just a little bit slower than the ball, unless the ball is either at the top or bottom of our camera view. Then the ball is moving at the same speed as the camera. Once we're back inside Unity, we then need to add a rigid body to our camera. So I'm going to select our camera, go to Add Component, and then select Rigid Body. I'm then going to turn off using gravity, and I'm going to freeze the position in the X and the Y. I'm then going to freeze the rotation in the X, the Y, and the Z. That way our camera can only move forward and backward. Then with a rigid body, we need to add some sort of collider. So I'm just going to add a box collider because they're the most basic. I'm then going to select our ball object where I can assign our camera rigid body. So I'm going to then grab our camera game object and drag it into that field. I'm then going to set the ball speed to 5 and the camera speed to 4. And then let's test our game. There we go. It looks like our camera, as we can see in our scene view, our camera is moving along with our ball, but our ball is moving just a little bit faster than our camera. Now let's add the constraints to our ball speed so that our ball starts going the speed of the camera when our ball reaches the end of the camera view. So I'm going to go back to our code. Now let's create some new variables up at the top. The first one is going to be a public float, and this will be our min ball distance. The next one is going to be a public float, and this is going to be our max ball distance. Let's create one more variable. This is going to be a public float, and we're going to call this current ball distance. And this is the distance from the camera. Now let's create a function to calculate the distance between the ball and the camera. So I'm going to scroll down. Here we'll type void, and then this will be our ball camera distance. Inside this function, we can set our current ball distance equal to vector3.distance, and for the first parameter, we want to pass in the position of our camera. So I'm going to type myCamera.transform.position, and then for the second parameter, we can pass in this transform.position. We then need to call this function, and we can call it within our update function right here. So I'm going to type ball camera distance. Now that we have the current distance between the camera and the ball, we need to set some conditions within our forward movement function so that our ball will move at the same speed as our camera if the ball is outside some bounds that we've created. If it's inside the bounds, then we want the ball to move at the ball speed. So let's scroll down to our forward movement function, which is right here. I'm first going to start by adding an if statement around this line of code here. So I'm going to type if, and then we're going to check to see if our current ball distance is less than max ball distance, and we're going to check to see if current ball distance is greater than min ball distance. So if our ball is within these bounds that we'll set, then we want our ball to move at the ball speed. But if our ball is outside those bounds, then we want it to move at the same speed as our camera. So I'm going to add an else statement, which will check for the opposite conditions as our if statement. And then inside our else statement, I'm going to type myRB.velocity equals vector3.forward, and then we're going to multiply it by camera speed. Now let's save the script. We'll go back to Unity so that we can set our max and our min distance. To find these values, I'm just going to move the ball within our scene view so that it is just barely inside our camera view at the bottom and the top of our screen, and then I'll use the ball's position to find the Z value that we need to set these variables to. Okay, so I think I found the min and the max distance value. For the min, I put it at 1, and for the max, I put it at 40. Now I did also change the transform for our camera because I felt like 40 wasn't a sharp enough angle. So I set its X rotation to 60, and then I moved it up in the Y direction to 25. This also made it so that I had to move our ball's starting position to 3 in the Z direction instead of 8. Now let's click play and we'll see if our current ball distance updates. And there you can see that our current ball distance is updating, and it's actually getting bigger because our ball is moving faster than our camera, and so the distance between them is also getting bigger. Now the last control that we need to add to the ball is the ability to speed up and slow down the ball when you click and drag the mouse vertically across the screen. So let's go back to our script. Now for this, we're going to be using our ball force to increase or decrease the speed of our ball. So let's scroll down to the bottom and create a new function. Now to do this, we're going to be using my ball force variable, but I actually thought of a better way to do this control and a better name for this variable. So I'm going to change this variable name to bonus ball speed. Now let's scroll down to our forward movement function. So first off, we're going to be working within our if statement because we want our players to be able to control the ball freely if the ball is within those bounds. And so inside our if statement, we are setting the velocity of our ball to ball speed, and this is going to be like the default speed. And so after this line of code, we're going to add the controls. And so what we want to do is create an if statement, and we're going to check to see if the player is clicking the left mouse button or touching the screen. And so I'm going to look for input.getButton, and then we're going to look for fire1. Inside this if statement, we first want to create a new local variable. This is going to be of type float, and I'm going to call it up-down speed. And then we want to set it equal to input.getAxis, and then we want to look for mouse space Y, and that will get our vertical movement of our mouse. We then want to multiply this by our bonus ball speed. After this line of code, we're going to reset the velocity of our ball to be the ball speed plus this new up-down speed variable. And so I'm going to type my rb.velocity equals vector3.forward, and then I'm going to multiply it by parentheses ball speed plus up-down speed. Now let's save this script and go back to Unity. Once we're back in Unity, I'm going to, for now, set my bonus ball speed to something like 3, and then I'm going to click play and see if this control works. So here we have our ball moving, and when I left click and then move my mouse forward, you can see how the speed of the ball changes. Now it's a little jumpy, and I'm wondering if that's because all of these controls are happening within the fixed update function. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to switch it over to just the update function and see if it works better. So let's go ahead and click play. And there we can see, it might be a little bit better. It's also probably hard to say how fast the ball is speeding up and slowing down because we don't have any other objects on the platform. So I'm going to add in some cubes to our platform. All right, now let's click play and I'll see if it I think it needs to be a little bit faster. So I'm just going to bump up that speed. Let's try something like 10. It's a little fast. It's hard to say. Alright, so I spent some time and I played around with the bonus ball speed, and I found that 30 is about the right value that we want to have. And so let's click play and we'll test it one more time. So here you can see that the ball follows my mouse pretty closely. Now it's not perfect, and if we wanted to, we could spend more time testing other controls and getting our gameplay a little more refined. But for now, this will work perfectly. Inside this function, we can set our current ball distance equal to vector3.distance. For the first parameter, we only want to use the Z position of our camera. And so I'm going to type new vector3. For the X position, we're going to type 0. For the Y position, we want to type 0. And for the Z position, we want to type myCamera.transform.position.Z. For the second parameter, we only want to use the Z position of our ball. And so I'm going to type new vector3. For the X, I'm going to pass in a 0. For the Y, I'm going to pass in a 0. And for the Z, I'm going to pass in transform.position.Z. We then need to call this function, and I'm going to call it within our update function. And so right here, I'm going to type ball camera distance. And so here we have this else statement, which is checking to see if the ball is currently outside those bounds. And if it's outside those bounds, we then don't have any controls like we do in our if statement. And so let's add in some controls. So the first thing that we want to do is check to see if our player is clicking the left mouse button. And so I'm going to type if input.get button and then fire1. The next thing that we need to do is get the axis, and so I'm going to type float, and we can call this up down speed. I'm then going to set it equal to input.get axis, and then we're going to check for mouse space y, and then we can multiply it by our bonus ball speed. Now this is where our code varies from our if statement. The next thing that we need to do is check to see which bounds we are outside of. Are we outside the bounds at the top of the screen or the bounds at the bottom of the screen? And so I'm going to check to see if current ball distance is greater than max ball distance. And we could say greater than or equal to. We then want to check to see if our up-down speed is negative. If it's negative, then we can apply it to our velocity. So I'm going to check if up-down speed is less than 0. If it is, then we want to copy this line where we set the velocity and paste it in here. That way, if our ball is up at the top of our screen, we can only slow down the ball. We can't speed it up. Now we need to do the same thing, but for the boundary at the bottom of our screen. And so outside this if statement, I'm going to type another one, and we're going to check to see if current ball distance is less than or equal to min ball distance. Then we can check to see if our up-down speed is positive. And so I'm going to type if up-down speed is greater than 0, we can then apply the velocity. So now let's save this and we'll go back to Unity and test it out. So now when I click play, you can see that the ball no longer gets stuck at the bottom of the screen, and it no longer gets stuck at the top of the screen. I can keep moving it. Now that's all the user input controls that we need for the ball. The next thing that we need to do is create the interactions between the ball and the other objects in our scene. But before we start coding the interactions, we actually need to create the objects for our ball to interact with. And from what I could tell in the game, there's about 3 main objects that we need to create for our ball to interact with. The first type of object is what we'll call a neutral object. These vary in size and shape, and they're usually colored white, same as the ball. And the only interaction that they have with the ball is basic physics. And so let's create one of these using one of the cubes that we added to our scene. Now the only thing that we have to do is add a rigid body to this cube. Now let's click play and we'll see how our ball interacts with this cube. So what we can do now is we can rename this cube to neutral cube, and then we can make a prefab out of it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some other neutral objects. I'm going to use a sphere, I'm going to use a cylinder, and if I wanted to, I could model various shapes and create neutral objects out of those shapes. Alright, so I have these 3 basic shapes which I've created neutral object prefabs out of. If I wanted to, I could add more and I could model more, but I'm going to call it good for now. Now the next object that our ball can interact with is what we'll call enemy objects. And these are usually the same types of shapes and they can vary in size, but they're usually colored something different. And the interaction that our ball has with these objects is that the ball will break apart and it will cause a game over and require you to restart the level. Now to create these objects, all we have to do is apply a different material to them and then add a tag that will be something like enemy. And so let's do that. Alright, so I've applied a new material to our 3 neutral objects, and then I renamed our neutral objects to be enemy cube, enemy sphere, and enemy collider. Now we need to add a tag, and so I'm going to select the tag drop-down menu. I'm then going to go to add tag. We're then going to click this plus sign, and we're going to type in enemy. We can then select our 3 enemy objects and then use the tag drop-down menu to select the enemy option. Once we've done that, we can drag each of these objects into our prefabs folder to create new prefabs out of these objects. We then want to select original prefab. Once we have these prefabs, I'm then going to remove all of them except for one, and then I'm going to move that one further down our platform. Now let's start coding the interaction between our ball and this object. And so let's go back to our player controller script. Inside the script, we're going to create an onCollisionEnter function, so down at the bottom. And so I'm going to type void and then onCollisionEnter. Inside this function, we first need to check to see what the tag of the other object is. And so we're going to use this collision parameter to get that tag. So I'm going to type if collision.other.tag, and we're going to check to see if it's equal to the string enemy. And I just realized that other is obsolete, and so we're going to use rigid body. Inside this if statement, for now, we'll just destroy our ball object. And so I'm going to type destroy, and then I'm going to pass in this dot game object. Now let's save the script. We'll go back to Unity and test our game. Alright, so here we go, and once we collide with our enemy cube object, you can see that the ball is destroyed. Now our camera keeps moving forward because we set its velocity, and the velocity will be constant unless something changes that speed. Now the ColorBump 3D game actually has a pretty cool ball breaking effect, that when the ball collides with an enemy object, the ball then breaks apart into a few smaller pieces. Now that's an effect that I won't be creating at this point in time, but if I wanted to, I could instantiate a particle effect in place of my sphere when it's destroyed. Now the last object that our ball can interact with is the finish line for this scene. And so let's create that finish line, and then we'll code its interaction. Alright, so here I've created my finish line. Now the parent object is an empty game object, which I've set the scale in the X direction to 40, I've set the scale in the Y direction to 10, and then the Z is 1. I've also set the Z position to 90 so that it's near the end of our platform, but there's still a little bit of space after the finish line. Now the first child object is an empty game object with a box collider attached to it, and I've set isTrigger equal to true. I then set the position of this object to 0.5 in the Y direction. That way when we scale the parent object, this object will grow taller. The second child object is what I call line, and this is just a 3D cube that I've scaled to be a line across our platform. I then removed the box collider off this 3D cube so that the ball won't interact with it. Now the last important thing about this finish line object is that I've set it and all of its children to the tag of finish line. Now what we can do is we can create a prefab out of this object by dragging it into our prefabs folder. Now that we've created this object, we can start programming the interaction between the ball and our finish line. So I'm going to go back to our player controller script. Now for this interaction, we're going to need the onTriggerEnter function because we're using a trigger. And so I'm going to type void onTriggerEnter. Now the first thing that we want to do inside this function is check to see what the tag of the other object is. And so I'm going to type if other.tag equals quotes finish line. Then what we could do is we could start a timer, and when that timer runs out, we could then load into the next level. And it seems like that's how Color Bump 3D works. But I think what I want to do is have a congratulations panel, and then have a button that allows the players to proceed to the next level, and maybe a button that has them return to a main menu. But for this, let's create a new script. So I'm going to go back to Unity, and then inside our scripts folder, I'm going to right click, go to create C# script, and then let's name this level manager. Let's open it up inside Visual Studios. Inside here, we want to create some variables. The first one is going to be a public game object, and this will be our win panel. And then the next one will be a public game object, and this will be our game over panel. And to make it a little bit easier to access these variables, let's create a singleton for this script. So I'm going to type public static and then level manager, and we'll call this LM. And then in the start function, let's type level manager.lm equals this. Now we don't need to have a don't destroy on load or anything like that, because we're only going to have one of these scripts per scene, and each level or scene is going to have a different one, and so we don't want to have this persist from scene to scene. So let's save this now and then go back to our player controller script. Once back inside our player controller script, we can then enable our win panel by accessing our level manager.lm.win panel, and then we're going to say .setActive, and we're going to set it to true. Now one other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the velocity for our camera to be 0. And so I'm going to type camera rb.velocity equals vector3.0. Now we can also do this kind of stuff for when we lose the game. And so up in our onCollisionEnter function, I'm going to enable our game over panel. And so I'm going to type level manager.lm.gameoverpanel.setActive, and I'm going to set it to true. I'm then also going to set the velocity for our camera to be 0. And so I'm going to type camera rb.velocity equals vector3.0. So that's everything for ending our level. We have a condition for if our player gets destroyed, and we have a condition for if our player crosses the finish line. Now what we need to do next is handle the start of our game so that the ball doesn't start rolling until the player is ready for it. And to do this, I'm going to go back over to our level manager script, and I'm going to create some new variables. So that's everything that we need to handle the end of each level. We have a condition for if our player gets destroyed, and we have a condition for if our player crosses the finish line. The next thing that we need to do is create some code for the start of our game so that the player has control of when the ball starts rolling. And to do this, I want to go back over to our level manager script, and I'll add in a variable. The first variable that we're going to create is going to be a panel for the start of our level. And so this is going to be a public game object, and we'll call this start panel. Now the next variable that we need to create will be a boolean for if our game has started playing. And so this is going to be a public bool, and I'm going to call it is started. Now in Color Bump 3D, the player has to drag their finger across the screen in order for the ball to start rolling. But I think what would be better is to just have a button that then sets this boolean to be true. And so what we need to do is create a function to pair to that button. And that button is going to be part of our start panel. And so I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this script. We can also remove the update function. In this script, we're going to create a public void function, and we'll call this start game. And all we need to do inside this function is set our isStarted equal to true, and then we need to disable our start panel. So I'm going to call start panel dot set active, and then I'm going to pass in false. Now let's use this isStarted variable in our player controller script. So first off, we want to add a condition to the start of our update function. And so I'm going to type if level manager.lm.isStarted, and we want to check to see if this is false. So I'm going to add an exclamation point out in front. If it's false, that means that we don't want to run any of the other code in our game. And so I'm going to return. I'm then going to copy this if statement. I'm going to add it at the start of our fixed update function. This will make it so that the ball doesn't start rolling until the player clicks that play button. Now what we need to do is set our isStarted variable to false whenever we die or when we cross the finish line. So I'm going to scroll down to our onCollisionEnter function, and inside this if statement I'm going to call levelManager.lm.isStarted, and I'm going to set it equal to false. I'm then going to copy this line, and I'm going to add it to our onTriggerEnter function inside this if statement. So let's save this script and we'll go back to Unity. Inside Unity, we need to create our start panel, our win panel, and our game over panel. So in the hierarchy, I'm going to go to create UI, and then I'm going to select panel. We can then right click on our panel, go down to UI, we'll select text, and then we're going to resize this text and move it up to the top of our screen. Alright, so I've added this text, I moved it up to the top, and then I changed the text so that it said level 01. I'm then going to right click on our start panel, and I'm going to go down to UI, and I'm going to select button. I'm then going to reposition this button near the bottom of our screen. Alright, so I've moved this button down and I changed the text so that it says go. Now what we need to do is apply our level manager to an object in the scene. So I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to rename this object to level manager. I'm then going to select our level manager script and drag it into the inspector. We then need to set our start panel. So I'm going to select our start panel and drag it into that field. Now we still need to create our win panel and our game over panel. To do this, I'm just going to duplicate our start panel, and then I'm going to rename it. We can then change the text to say level passed or something like that. Level passed. I'm then going to duplicate our win panel, and I'm going to rename this to game over. We can then change the text. And we can update the button. Now what we need to do is assign our panel variables. So I'm going to select our winner panel, drag it into the win panel field. I'm going to select the game over object and drag it into our game over panel field. Then what we can do is disable our win panel and our game over panel. Now what we need to do is pair our start game function to this button on our start panel. So I'm going to scroll down to the on click this plus sign, and then going to drag in our level manager, and then I'm going to use the drop down menu to select level manager and then start game. Now let's test our game. So here you can see that our game isn't going, the ball isn't moving, and now when I click go, it starts moving. Let's see what happens when I collide with the enemy cube. There we have our game over panel. It says maybe next time, try again. And let's try it one more time, but this time we'll reach the finish line. And there we go, we've passed the level, we've enabled our win panel, and it says level passed, next level. Now what we need to do is create some functions to pair to this button and the button on our game over panel. And so let's go back to our level manager script. Inside here we need to create one more variable, and this will be for our current level. And so this is going to be a public int, and I'm going to call this level number. Now let's scroll down to the bottom of this function and we can create two more public functions. One is going to be a public void, and this is going to be called our try again. Right. Now before we type anything inside this function, we need to add a namespace up at the top. This is going to be using Unity Engine .scene management. Then we can scroll back down to our function, and in here we can call scene manager .load scene, and we're going to pass in level number. For the next function, we'll create public void and we'll call it next level. Inside this function, we want to add 1 to our level number, and then we want to load that level. And so I'm going to type level number equals level number plus 1. And then we want to call scene manager .load scene, and we want to pass in level number. Now let's save this script and go back to Unity. Once back in Unity, we want to select our win panel. We want to expand it and select the button that is attached to it. We then want to scroll down to the on click. We're going to click the plus sign. We're then going to drag in the level manager. And since this is the win panel, we want to load into the next level. And so we're going to use the drop down menu to select level manager and then find our next level function. We then need to select our game over panel. I'm going to expand it and then going to select the button. And this is going to be our try again function. And so let's scroll down to the on click. We'll click the plus sign. We'll then drag in the level manager. We'll then use the drop down menu to select level manager, and then we'll find the try again function. Now in order to test these buttons, we need to add this scene to our build order and create a new scene and then add that scene to our build order. And so I'm going to save this scene, go to File, Save As, I'm going to find our scenes folder, and I'm going to rename this to level 1, 01. We can then change some of the features in this scene and then resave it as the next level. And so I'm going to select our start panel. I'm going to get the text object and then going to change this to level 2. I'm then going to go up to File, Save As, select our scenes folder, and then going to save this as level 02. Then what we can do is go up to our File, Build Settings, and then going to select our scenes folder. I'm going to drag in level 1, and then I'm going to drag in level 2, and we can remove this. Okay. Then what we want to do is load back into our level 1 scene, and then I'm going to click play and test these buttons. So let's click the go button, and now our ball's rolling, and when I collide with our enemy cube, our game over panel pops up, and then I can click try again, which will then reload our level 1. Now when I click go, my ball starts rolling, and I'm going to avoid the enemy object. And then once we reach the finish line, which will be any second, there we have our win panel pop up, and then I can click next level, which will load us into level 02. So it looks like everything's working. Now as far as level progression goes, I actually played to the end of the basic levels for Color Bump 3D. I think there was at the time 250 levels. And then once I beat the 250th level, it then had a congratulations screen. And so we could create a new scene that says, congratulations, you passed all of the levels that we've created. And then you could have a button that just restarts them back to level 1 or something like that. Now, so far in this video, we've talked about all of the controls in the Color Bump 3D game and all of the interactions between the player and the different objects in the scene. But what we haven't done is any level design. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So in Color Bump 3D, they had different segments for each level, and inside each segment there were different patterns and combinations of neutral objects and enemy objects. They had different sizes, different shapes, and different arrangements. But what I noticed as I played the game more is that they reused these different segments to build each individual level. So they just made different combinations of these segments, of these smaller patterns of different shapes. And so that's what I would spend the next several hours or even days doing, is creating these different segment prefabs. And once I have a good collection of segment prefabs, I would then start creating the different levels, and I could make the levels progressively harder as they go along. And so what I want to do next is show you how to create maybe 1 or 2 of these segment prefabs, and then I think we'll be good to conclude this tutorial. And so to create a segment, I would start with an empty game object. So I'm going to go to create empty, and then we can rename this to, we'll say segment 1, 0, 1. We then want to center this object in the X direction, the Y direction, and then the Z direction doesn't really matter, but I'll put it at, we'll say 50. Then what we want to do is go to our prefabs folder, and we want to use our enemy objects and our neutral objects and just arrange them in different patterns on our platform. You also want to make these prefabs children to your segment object, and then you can also use Control-D to duplicate your prefabs so that it goes a little bit faster. And so here I've created my first segment. Now I'm going to select it, I'm going to minimize it, and then we need to make a prefab out of this. But I want to put all of my segments in a different folder than what I have my other prefabs in. And so I'm going to make a child folder to my prefabs folder, and we can call this segments. I can then select our segment object from our hierarchy and drag it into the segments folder. Then what I can do is I can select this segment and drag it into my scene, and it'll create a duplicate of it that I can then drag to a new position. And so I could create a whole level just out of this segment. And then if I wanted to have more room in my level, I could select my platform game object and I could increase the size of its scale in the Z direction. So I'm going to say 200. And then we can move our finish line down to the end. Next, I'd like to create one more segment, and then we'll play our first level and test it out. Alright, so here I have my second segment. I'm going to collapse it, I'm going to select it and drag it into our segments folder. Now I think I'm ready to test my game. So let's hit play. I'm then going to click go, and now our ball's rolling. I'm going to see if I can avoid all of the black objects. So far it's looking pretty good. Oh, we're pushing. Oh no. Whoa. Okay, right on. And I can even bump some of these objects into, oh, come on. I was getting too close. Let's try it again. Let me see if I can bump. Oh, again, one more time. I'm going to bump these objects into other objects. And that is pretty sweet. Now, we could probably increase the mass on some of these objects so they don't fly too far, so they're a little harder to move. But it's looking pretty good. Made it through. Across the finish line. Click next level. There we go. Alright, so that's everything that I'm going to cover in this lesson on how to create ColorBump 3D. Now just a reminder, you can play ColorBump 3D on Android and iOS. It is currently sitting at number 2 on the top free charts for Android. It's a pretty cool game. I had a lot of fun playing it, and I had even more fun creating it. If you liked this video, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you were able to follow along and recreate your own version of ColorBump 3D, then let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your success, and if you need help, then leave your questions in the comments below as well. If you need more help, then you can also join our Discord server, which is linked to in the description below. Make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.